My name is Elizabeth Blaney, and I am with Unión de Vecinos. We are the East Side chapter of the Los Angeles Tenants Union. So we entered into a wave of gentrification that took place and was only slowed down by the 2008 economic crisis that really kind of put a halt in the East Side and in other parts of Los Angeles. And when I talk today, I'm going to focus on Los Angeles just because that's where I'm located and that's where I've been for the last 30 years. And so that was gentrification was the issue. And then it switched during the crisis to this lack of preservation around housing stock within the city, allowing buildings to go into disrepair, not being the city of LA, especially in our district, and then COVID hit. And for COVID, like all across the world, it was about we have no money to pay our rent. We can't work, we're stuck in our homes, we can't pay our rent. And so that became the thing. And we just had, for us, our COVID protections just got lifted on February 1st. That was the last COVID protection that we had of 2024 in terms of now rent increases are allowed. They were not allowed previously. Evictions were allowed to happen starting a year ago, April, and now rent increases could happen. So the crisis here is still non-payment of rent. And we have seen evictions, almost triple beyond pre-COVID levels. And it's 96% of those are related to non-payment. And because you can now evict for the COVID debt, before you couldn't evict for the COVID debt, now you can evict for a COVID rent debt that you had. So in addition, people just can't pay their regular rent, they can't pay the COVID, and now increases are about to happen. So in addition to that, the other current pressure we have is, as a way of getting around some of the tenant protections, landlords have looked towards demolition as a loophole. That's what we have as a loophole here allowed in the city of LA. You can demolish to get out of rent control laws. And you can do something called the Ellis Act, which is another law that allows you just to remove your unit from the rental market. We are founded more in Paulo Freire, popular education methodology, and so we're very much grounded in that. And so over time, we have come up and utilized different definitions. And so I'll just read one, just to kind of give a little bit of a sense. So one that we have is seize every opportunity and intentionally try to create spaces where people are at politically, on a political level, and understanding the material conditions of the ground in terms of what the struggle of where people are at. Intervene to build consciousness of the class nature of rich versus poor, starting with the landlord-tenant relationship as a basis, and towards thinking at the level of systems and structures and how to act collectively to transform these. So this is and this definition came out of, we have a communist caucus within the LA Tenants Union. And so this is a definition of folks who are within the LA Tenants Union, who are communists and who are across locals, across chapters, doing this kind of organizing so that we can have housing for everyone and education for everyone and healthcare for everyone. Because even though we start from the landlord-tenant relationship, we understand that there's more than just having your home. There's a whole other, it's about the tenant themselves and everything they need to live in this life with a better quality of life. Disruption is really the key in terms of the popular education strategies, because there are other strategies. Protests, yes, we use them as a way of bringing visibility, but we also know that those, people, that they're prepared for that. Landlords are prepared for that. Politicians are prepared for that. That's a normal part of business. So how do we change things where we disrupt them economically? A campaign that really was the catalyst for many other rent strikes across the city. When people heard about, oh, you actually got to stay, that's not what the typical practice was. So when we came into COVID and people couldn't pay their rent, and that's why you see here, comida sí, renta no, food, not rent, that was able, if we hadn't had that experience of the rent strike with the mariachis, I don't think we would have been as successful or ready to go for a Latu-wide rent strike, a citywide rent strike during COVID. And people were saying, I'm going to pay for my food and I'm not going to worry about the rent. It was very empowering to realize I can survive with not paying my rent. I am not going to be evicted. And we did have some tenant protections that helped supported that, but people had a completely different turn at that point. To the point where we would see that there would be some landlords who just ignored the protections. And I know we see this in other places in different cities across the world, but they would just come in and as a tenant would go out to work, or they were watching if they were going to be there, go in, throw their stuff on the street, change the locks. And so before, when that would kind of happen before COVID, not as rampant, but there were occasions when it happened, tenants would be just kind of like, all right, time to go. But tenants were like, no, they would call their local, they would call their TA, and they would get back in. And many of us have bolt cutters in the back of our cars and, packets of stuff ready to go for when that happens. And tenants were like, no, I'm coming back in. I'm going to reclaim my home. And so that I think that power of feeling like they're not going to take it anymore and taking that action and talking to the police and having the police come in and say, no, 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 the landlord's right. And the tenant saying, no, 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 I'm staying here, was a complete shift and transformation that was really rooted partly because of the conditions of the time, but partly because of this process of working together and direct action over a couple of years of standing up to landlords and changing the balance of power between landlord and tenant. When people feel empowered, I'll share one last story when we were working with a neighborhood committee, and this had to do more with conditions in the neighborhood as opposed to a landlord-tenant thing. And the conditions in the neighborhood were such where the families were so afraid of their own neighbors or gang activity going on, and they wanted the police to solve their problem. And over a process of 8 years, they were actually kicking the police out of their community events, closing down streets, and refusing to allow the police to come in and monitor because they felt the police would communicate that this was an unsafe space and now they were in control of their neighborhood. And so it's just through daily activity, working in the neighborhood, organizing activities with their neighbors and dialogue and analysis and having different events like swap meets and closing down the streets for fairs and understanding that the gangs were just kids, like their own kids, and talking to them and not being antagonistic and building relationships with them so that it really changed the conditions that were creating some of the violence. But it was an 8-year process. And to be able to stand up to the police and be in a room with the police chief and said, we will delay our own celebration until you agree not to show up. And it worked. And so I think, that's, success of what popular education can do for a neighborhood. So we started using these strategies partly because other strategies were no longer working because landlords had already, come up with new creative responses, partly because tenants I've got nothing to lose. They were at the point of, there is no other place for me to go, so I might as well stay and fight. I might as well give it. So there was a shift in attitude when people started understanding that. When we talk about the rent strike during COVID and people accumulating debt and how people think about debt, shame, failure. How could I do this? And so we had to do a lot of political education around the fact, well, is this your fault? Did you just go out and spurge your rent on a new plasma 85-inch type TV? No, you bought food, you paid bills, you tried to survive. This debt was not created by you. Let's talk about the unreasonable about this debt and how exaggerated it is and how this money is used really for landlords. We had one landlord who sent the classified job ad section in a letter to a tenant. Here, go find a job. I found some for you. And we sent it back and said, why don't you go take one of these jobs instead of sitting there waiting for me to pay your rent to sustain you? And so people started to understand that dynamic of their labor was being in place for a class that wasn't working. And I think that shift, angered people and started to shed some of the guilt. And then understanding that debt is power. So in this particular building with the mariachi, so they went on strike and they won, and they were paying their rent and everything was great. COVID hits, they go on strike again for 4 years. And they had a collective debt of over $250,000 to this landlord. And so, but people weren't feeling like, oh my God, are we going to pay $250,000? It was like, this is our bargaining chip. This is power. He wants that money from us. And it's going to be costly for him to evict us. And so they negotiated, and through negotiations, negotiated a 50% rent reduction of their debt. And we had other tenants who not only did a reduction in their debt, also reduced their rent. So when tenants started to see this power that they had through this debt, that is also a transformative. Political education isn't something that just happens in a class. It happens at every moment and every opportunity. If I have somebody sitting across from me bringing their case, it's as I'm talking about their case, where the moments of analysis that I can bring in to help them think through and understand the root causes of why they're even sitting here with an eviction notice with me. Up until even having our meetings and bringing different elements and analysis of what's going on in the city, what's even going on in an international level, because we do a lot of work with comrades in Venezuela and bringing folks together to talk about those conditions. So it ranges. And so I think also through political education processes have also contributed to our strategies changing over time. So one concrete example, and I think this is very key in any struggle that you're in, is unity and accountability. Those two things together. I don't think you can have one without the other if you want to have power. And with respect, and I'll give you an example with respect to the mariachi rent strike, people are very energetic in the beginning, but when we know this is a long haul process, we know people are going to start to wane. And so we sat down and we had some community agreements that were drawn up in which everybody signed. And part of it also was because we had started eviction, this was an organizing strategy. We did have an attorney and to do a legal strategy, and the legal strategy was buy as much time as you can so the organizing strategy can work. And so with the community agreements, it was tied to, if you want legal representation, then you need to also commit to these community agreements. And the community agreements were, first and foremost, do not have any individual conversation with a landlord. If a landlord or manager reaches out, tell the group chat, bring it to the group, and let's talk about it. So to prevent the divide and conquer. If you, the other agreement was, if you are waning, if you are not sure, if you are feeling pressure and you want to leave, bring it to the group. And let's talk about it and solve it as a group. And we had 2 people do that because of different kinds of conditions. And they did not want to leave the strike because they knew it would weaken the strikers. But they had to leave the building. They were in a position where they could no longer stay in the building and keep up the fight. And so what they did through, this hour-long meeting of different solutions, at the end of the day, they turned their keys over to the tenants and not the landlord. So now the tenants controlled that unit. And we had fundraisers and all kinds of things. And it meant that the tenant was still financially responsible for the rent. And in exchange for turning their keys over, their rent, there was a commitment made that part of the demands of any agreement side would be their rent would be forgiven. And that is what happened. And so I think that these community agreements and this accountability to each other, I think, is very, very important. I think the main outcome has been this kind of change in this balance of power and how tenants see themselves in relationship to their landlords. I think that the strategies are so successful partly because of consistency and commitment and understanding to the strategies, of constant evaluation of the strategies and dialogue. Again, it's not static, it's evolving. So it's evolving with the tenants and it's evolving with the organizers. We have a lot of new organizers who come into this work, and we have tenants who take on leadership roles who come into this. And so what does that mean? So as we talk about these strategies with them, as we act it out, as we experiment with different strategies, some strategies just don't work and haven't worked. And so we got to try something else. So I think having that flexibility, that understanding that popular education strategies are first and foremost evolving, that means they have to be flexible. That means that you're constantly learning new things. So something that you did 3 years ago may not work today in the conditions that you're at, or with the tenants that you're at who may not be ready. And so it's not a copy and paste type of model. And I think that's one of the key things. When you have people that understand that think about that read, we do, reading of theory and reading of current events and then analyzing those, that also gives us ideas in terms of how we talk about with folks. And then also our relationships in the international networks that we belong to. We learn a lot from those networks, not just in terms of the conditions that they're fighting, but also popular education strategies and how they're going about different things for the world that they're building. The reason why some of those strategies haven't always worked has been either we were off in our analysis on the conditions on the ground, or there were some people who just didn't trust that the tenants could take on certain leadership roles. And so there wasn't this tuning in. It was more like, well, I think this is where tenants are at, and not really recognizing, no, tenants are at a different place and are more ready to do something. So I think it's that disconnect. I think really some of the strategies failed because there's a disconnect between the organizer and the tenant, and not understanding where they're at, in not doing the analysis, and in not taking the time to build community. I've seen organizers that they just show up for the meeting, and the meeting is all about the meeting. And the meeting is structured in a way that is more of a report and telling rather than a collective structure with leadership and with the tenants in the room building this together. And that is where I've seen popular education strategies fail. In terms of things that we've learned, it takes time. And this is something for the long haul. This is something that goes beyond the campaign, that goes beyond the win, and is a constant building process. And so if in terms of things we do differently, I would think, so in those instances where maybe we've done something and we finally won, and then there's a sense of relief, it's like, okay, we've won. And don't take the break. You take the break to celebrate. But I think some of our TAs have then become inactive because they got the big win. And so it's like, no, and I get it. We have capacity issues, and organizers are also having other things they have to deal with in their own lives. And so that, getting people to think about that this is not just about the fact, fine, you got them in their house. Yay. We together with the tenants have got them in their houses. Now it's more like, okay, now what's the next thing? How do we continue? We've built this unity and this spirit and this collective of working together, organizing the masses. Why don't let go of it? Now we think about, well, let's look at our neighborhood. How do we strengthen our neighborhood? And I think, so that is something that we have to continue to do and force ourselves to do. So tips I would say is, you don't have to have all the answers, you as the organizer. And I get a lot of people do come asking us, and they don't want to start, because until they have the whole plan laid out of how it's supposed to go, they stop themselves from even beginning. So just start. You're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Learn from that. That's one. Two, remember who you're accountable to and who you're doing this for. It's not for yourself. And if you're not in dialogue with tenants or the base, and it's just, it's just about you're accountable to the organizers, no, you have to stop that. You are accountable to the base. At the end of the day, that are the people's lives that you're working with and that you're trying to change. And so the tenants have to be involved in this process. It's a collective process. It's an evolving process. It's a process that takes time. And above all, it's a process. Not sometimes the end goal is not the thing that's important. It's the process that's important.